They say that diplomacy is a dance, and in Japan, this dance is sacred, quiet, and multi-layered, with centuries of tradition and subtleties. Every movement, every pause, every intonation has its own meaning. In Tokyo's boardrooms, a minute of silence can be louder than 100 words, and a shared cup of sencha is not just refreshment, but a bridge between people. My name is Julia. For the past 6 months, I have been dancing to this slow, measured rhythm with Kogain Industries, one of the most powerful and traditional industrial conglomerates in East Asia. And I was close, very close. We were negotiating the implementation of 150 million worth of adaptive logistics software, a system designed to revolutionize the company's outdated infrastructure while preserving its reputation and hierarchy. It was a careful, delicate balance. But it was my world. I didn't just speak Japanese. I thought Japanese. I knew when to bow, when to pause, when to nod, and most importantly, when to remain silent. Silence is a tool, patience is power. By March, I was no longer just a foreign consultant. I was known and respected. Mr. Sakamoto, the deputy director of operations, even started calling me by my Japanese name. Hana Flower A, compliment. The kind you only get when you prove that you understand not only the language, but also the values behind it. I spent my nights in izakayas, my weekends poring over old documents, and countless hours refining our proposal to address concerns about data sovereignty, staff retraining, and long-term scalability. Every line of our presentation was reviewed, translated, and reworked until it resonated with their expectations. We were almost completely aligned. Then the board of directors in San Francisco decided to increase oversight. And Kevin appeared. I first saw him in a Slack message. "Hi, Julia, glad to join the team. Let's do this." Those words made my head spin. The deal I had been working on for 6 months wasn't fireworks. It was haiku. But I decided to give him a chance. Maybe he just needed some context. He arrived in Tokyo 3 days later, wearing a wrinkled blazer and Ray-Ban sunglasses pushed up on his forehead. The first thing he said to me in person was, "So you're the one who speaks languages? Let's see what kind of magic we can create." Our meeting with Kogane was scheduled for 9 a.m. At 9:18, Kevin walked into the conference room holding a latte, without bowing, apologizing, or, of course, realizing what he had just broken. In Japanese business culture, punctuality is not an option. It is respect. He sat down heavily, sighed theatrically, and opened his laptop. "Sorry for the traffic, but let's get down to business. Are we ready to sign or not?" Mr. Sakamoto didn't answer, neither did his assistant. Their eyes shifted to me. I tried to translate, softening my tone and rephrasing the question in a way that was appropriate for this culture. But Kevin waved his hand. "No, just tell them straight. We're here to make a deal, not flirt." I felt the air rush out of my lungs. For the next hour, Kevin dominated the conversation with the bravado of a salesman, completely ignoring the months of nuance I had put into our proposal. He threw around phrases like plug-and-play architecture and universal implementation, completely oblivious to the fact that we were talking to people who still referred to their internal departments with family metaphors. He dismissed their questions as delaying tactics. He laughed when they expressed concerns about confidentiality. "Come on, you think the NSA cares about manufacturing data?" I wanted to disappear. When we left the room, Kevin patted me on the back like we were old fraternity friends. "You did well, very calm, let me know if I crossed the line." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking that night. I sat in my hotel room and stared at the city skyline. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stared at the lights, slowly blinking in the fog, and tried to count how many steps back we had just taken. Kevin had destroyed 6 months of trust in an hour. The next morning, I received a message from Mr. Sakamoto's assistant. "Please confirm, will Mr. Kevin be attending the next session?" Translation: "If he is, we may not come." And suddenly, I saw a crossroads. One path led to silence, to complicity, to playing the role of a good soldier while the deal fell apart. The other? I didn't know yet, but I could feel it forming. Questions, decisions. A storm brewing. I wasn't going to stand by and watch everything burn because someone wanted to play alpha male in a silk suit. I was going to fix this, or leave it behind. And if I left, I wasn't going to go alone. The morning of the next session with Kogain Industries, I arrived 30 minutes early. The sky outside was clear, the air still and ceremonial. Tokyo's pulse beat just beneath the window glass of the boardroom where everything, months of trust, planning, alignment, was meant to culminate. I wore a subdued navy suit, the kind that said seriousness without arrogance. My binder of notes was immaculate, every document printed double-sided on ivory paper, every bullet point rehearsed. The tea was already poured when Mr. Sakamoto entered, followed by Mr. Tanaka and the other senior staff. The rhythm resumed. Gentle nods, measured bows, the language of mutual respect. Kogane's delegation settled into their places, and the scent of roasted sencha and ink filled the air. At 9:04 a.m., Kevin entered. Just late enough to be noticed, just loud enough to be disruptive. He wore a light gray suit with no tie, unbuttoned shirt collar, and that ridiculous smirk that made me clench my teeth behind a diplomatic smile. He offered a casual wave rather than a bow, mumbled something about traffic, and flopped into the chair beside mine. I opened the presentation materials and began in Japanese, walking the team through key updates and preparing to address the pending contractual clauses. My voice was steady, my cadence precise. Mr. Sakamoto nodded. Mr. Tanaka jotted down notes. We were recovering. Kogain was beginning to lean back into the table, into the trust. Then, just as I turned the page to the revised data integration timeline, Kevin tapped the edge of the lacquered table with his knuckle. Loud, intentional. He stood, pushed his chair back like he was on a talk show stage, and cleared his throat with theatrical gravity. I froze mid-sentence. Before we continue, he said, looking around the room with forced cheer, I want to make a quick announcement. Time slowed. As part of a strategic restructuring effort at HQ, he said, with faux sincerity, Julia will be stepping away from the project effective immediately. I blinked. Once. Twice. We deeply appreciate her contributions up to this point, he continued, not looking at me. But moving forward, I'll be taking the reins directly. He was smiling. I was not. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the translation assistant had paused, uncertain whether to relay Kevin's words in Japanese. I looked at Mr. Sakamoto. His face had lost its warmth. The slight nods of a moment ago had vanished, replaced by the kind of stillness that only meant one thing in Japanese business culture: offense. He turned slightly to Mr. Tanaka, who whispered something in low tones. Across the table, a junior associate shifted uncomfortably. I stood, calmly, deliberately. I gathered my documents and closed my binder with a soft click. My hands were steady. My voice, when I spoke, came out clear and flawless in their language. This is unexpected. Please consider it a temporary issue. I am deeply grateful for your continued trust and understanding. A flicker passed across Mr. Sakamoto's face. Not surprise, recognition. I bowed low, precisely, respectfully. Kevin remained seated. Then I turned and walked out. Each step slow, controlled, purposeful, not an exit of defeat, but of declaration. In the hallway, the silence was a different kind of heavy. Not awkward, not shameful, resolute. I stood by the elevator and pulled out my phone. No trembling, no tears, just thought. Kevin thought he was demonstrating dominance. He had no idea he'd just detonated the foundation beneath his own feet. Because what he didn't realize was that while he was playing theatrics, Mr. Sakamoto had been watching everything. He had seen who showed up early, who prepared the binders, who remembered the cultural nuances, who translated jokes, not just words, who built trust, and who just swept it off the table for a power play. Back in the room, I imagined the awkward silence, the scrambling, Kevin trying to reclaim control without context, without language, without the rhythm of the culture. I imagined Mr. Tanaka quietly texting someone on his team to delay the next phase, and I imagined Mr. Sakamoto placing a quiet call to his personal assistant, not to reschedule. BI didn't take the elevator. Instead, I walked to the stairwell, my heels echoing softly with each step down the steel stairs. I needed the rhythm, the motion. My mind wasn't swirling, it was sharpening. Kevin's stunt wasn't just unprofessional, it was a betrayal. But more than that, it was a miscalculation. He had underestimated not only my influence, but my resolve. Down in the lobby, I stood by the wide windows looking out over Tokyo's morning bustle. Salarymen in black suits passed in waves. The low murmur of morning traffic mixed with the occasional trill of a crosswalk. I watched the reflection of the building in the glass, and in it, I could still see the outline of the conference room upstairs, distorted by distance and tinted glass, but there. I stood for nearly a minute, long enough to feel my heartbeat return to steady. Then I turned. No hesitation, no plan. Just clarity. Upstairs, the room had turned stale. Kevin's voice carried in bursts as I neared the doors. Loud, performative, self-assured in all the wrong ways. Efficiency. Scalability. Executive vision. He was trying to command a room he didn't understand. I walked in without knocking, every pair of eyes turned. Kevin's expression flickered from confidence to irritation to disbelief. I didn't look at him. I looked directly at Mr. Sakamoto. "Excuse me," I said in English, soft but firm. Then I switched to Japanese. "May I have just a moment of your time?" There was a pause. Mr. Sakamoto gave a small nod. Kevin rose halfway from his chair, indignant. "Julia, I think you need to—" I raised a hand, not to silence him, but to acknowledge his attempt. "Just one moment," I said, still facing Mr. Sakamoto. Then, in careful, unhurried Japanese, "My employment status has changed. However, the trust we have built, your team and mine, is not defined by corporate structures. It's built on understanding, consistency, and shared respect. That does not need to end today." There was a murmur at the far end of the table. Mr. Tanaka whispered something to a colleague. Mr. Sakamoto's eyes stayed on mine. "Effective immediately," I continued. "I'm operating as an independent consultant. My proposal is simple: a 15% commission upon successful contract finalization, and my loyalty, from this point forward, belongs to you, not the company that just dismissed me." Another pause. Longer this time. A room full of seasoned negotiators, assessing not just the words, but the risk, the confidence behind them. I kept my tone even, my body still. No desperation, no panic, just truth. "My consulting fee as a freelance agent is now 15%, and I will work for you. Let's continue, somewhere else, where we can speak freely and constructively." Kevin let out a sharp laugh, incredulous. "That's absurd, Julia. This isn't how any of this works. You can't just flip sides like some kind of—" "She can," Mr. Sakamoto interrupted, quietly, firmly. He turned his head slightly, addressing Mr. Tanaka in Japanese. Tanaka nodded. "We would like to continue negotiations," Mr. Sakamoto said in measured English, looking directly at Kevin. "But only with Ms. Julia." Kevin stood stunned. For a moment, it looked like he might argue. But one look at Mr. Sakamoto's expression, calm, unyielding, shut that down. One of the assistants moved from the wall, gently collecting Kevin's materials. Another walked to the door and held it open. "Please wait outside," Mr. Sakamoto added. "This matter no longer concerns your firm." Kevin stood there, motionless. Then, defeated, he picked up his laptop and left. The door closed behind him with a soft thud that sounded more like a sealed fate. Inside the room, the silence returned. But now it felt different, focused. Mr. Sakamoto looked at me. "Julia-san, shall we continue?" I bowed. A deep, respectful incline from the waist. "Yes, let's." I didn't take the elevator. Instead, I I walked to the stairwell, my heels echoing softly with each step down the steel stairs. I needed the rhythm, the motion. My mind wasn't swirling, it was sharpening. Kevin's stunt wasn't just unprofessional, it was a betrayal. But more than that, it was a miscalculation. He had underestimated not only my influence, but my resolve. Down in the lobby, I stood by the wide windows looking out over Tokyo's morning bustle. Salarymen in black suits passed in waves, the low murmur of morning traffic mixed with the occasional trill of a crosswalk. I watched the reflection of the building in the glass, and in it, I could still see the outline of the conference room upstairs, distorted by distance and tinted glass. But there, I stood for nearly a minute, long enough to feel my heartbeat return to steady. Then I turned. No hesitation, no plan, just clarity. Upstairs, the room had turned stale. Kevin's voice carried in bursts as I neared the doors. Loud, performative, self-assured in all the wrong ways. Efficiency. Scalability. Executive vision. He was trying to command a room he didn't understand. I walked in without knocking. Every pair of eyes turned. Kevin's expression flickered from confidence to irritation to disbelief. I didn't look at him. I looked directly at Mr. Sakamoto. "Excuse me," I said in English, soft but firm. Then I switched to Japanese. "May I have just a moment of your time?" There was a pause. Mr. Sakamoto gave a small nod. Kevin rose halfway from his chair, indignant. "Julia, I think you need to—" I raised a hand, not to silence him, but to acknowledge his attempt. "Just one moment," I said, still facing Mr. Sakamoto. Then, in careful, unhurried Japanese, "My employment status has changed. However, the trust we have built, your team and mine, is not defined by corporate structures. It's built on understanding, consistency, and shared respect. That does not need to end today." There was a murmur at the far end of the table. Mr. Tanaka whispered something to a colleague. Mr. Sakamoto's eyes stayed on mine. "Effective immediately," I continued. "I am operating as an independent consultant. My proposal is simple: a 15% commission upon successful contract finalization. And my loyalty from this point forward belongs to you, not the company that just dismissed me." Another pause. Longer this time. A room full of seasoned negotiators assessing not just the words, but the risk, the confidence behind them. I kept my tone even, my body still. No desperation, no panic, just truth. My consulting fee as a freelance agent is now 15%, and I will work for you. Let's continue, somewhere else, where we can speak freely and constructively. Kevin let out a sharp laugh, incredulous. "That's absurd, Julia. This isn't how any of this works. You can't just flip sides like some kind of—" "She can," Mr. Sakamoto interrupted, quietly, firmly. He turned his head slightly, addressing Mr. Tanaka in Japanese. Tanaka nodded. "We would like to continue negotiations," Mr. Sakamoto said in measured English, looking directly at Kevin, "but only with Ms. Julia." Kevin stood stunned. For a moment, it looked like he might argue, but one look at Mr. Sakamoto's expression, calm, unyielding, shut that down. One of the assistants moved from the wall, gently collecting Kevin's materials. Another walked to the door and held it open. "Please wait outside," Mr. Sakamoto added. "This matter no longer concerns your firm." Kevin stood there, motionless. Then, defeated, he picked up his laptop and left. The door closed behind him with a soft thud that sounded more like a sealed fate. Inside the room, the silence returned, but now it felt different. Focused, Mr. Sakamoto looked at me. "Julia-san, shall we continue?" I bowed, a deep, respectful incline from the waist. "Yes, let's." I resumed my seat, opened my binder, and began. What they didn't know, what Kevin could never have guessed, was that I'd been preparing for this. 3 weeks earlier, I had quietly begun registering my own consulting firm. I'd seen the signs, the subtle exclusion from strategy calls, the unspoken shift in tone from upper management. The way credit for my work began disappearing from slide decks. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. My company, Tanabata Consulting, was already legally filed with all necessary documents in place. I had opened a business account, purchased a domain, and drafted client-facing materials. My business model, my rate structure, my transition strategy, it was all there. Waiting. I knew I couldn't trust them to keep me. Not after the way the wind had shifted in our last QBR. Not after Kevin's sudden involvement. Not after months of being the silent workhorse with no recognition. The irony? Kevin didn't even have the authority, or the documentation, to fire me. His announcement in the room had been theatrical, but unofficial. There were no HR signatures, no formal termination letter, no record in the system, which meant legally I was still an employee, and that put the company in a very awkward position. Any obstruction from their side now, any move to block me, would be seen as retaliatory, and I had already documented everything, every call, every omission, every version of the proposal I had created. The IP was traceable, and much of it was mine. The 15% I mentioned? That wasn't a bluff. It was built into my client contract templates, ready to be sent, signed, executed. All it needed was a name, and in that moment, I had just secured my first one. Kogane Industries wasn't just my first client. It was a signal, a confirmation that my instincts had been right, and the quiet work I had done behind the scenes was not only seen, but remembered. I didn't take revenge. Not the way Kevin probably expected. There were no smear campaigns, no dramatic exposés, no lawsuits. That would have been too obvious, too loud, and frankly, beneath me. Instead, I whispered. It began with a carefully crafted article on a respected Japanese business forum, published under my name. I outlined best practices in cross-cultural software integration, focusing on the delicate interplay between modernization and cultural preservation. I didn't mention any company names, but I referenced anonymized case studies Kevin had never understood, let alone authored. It struck a chord. The article spread quietly but powerfully, passed from manager to department head, from engineer to executive assistant. Then came a white paper, not translated, written, in Japanese. Native structure, native nuance. I outlined a framework for legacy manufacturers to implement data systems without compromising hierarchical integrity or face-saving protocols. It was, for many of them, the first time someone had explained transformation in terms that respected their traditions. At the bottom, in the smallest font, consultations available upon request, priority given to former associates. I didn't poach, I didn't pitch. I reminded. I reached out gently, with care. A quiet congratulations on a company award. A respectful nod to a recent leadership change. I sent brief messages with links to translated policy updates from the Ministry of Economy, summarized white papers on automation in rural prefectures, and occasionally shared industry benchmarks tailored to their verticals. Every word was chosen with precision, every tone calibrated. Each note ended simply, "If I can be of service, I'm only a message away." There were no asks, only openings. Kevin didn't even know the platforms I used existed. These weren't LinkedIn blasts or MailChimp campaigns. They were industry BBS boards, alumni group forums, and encrypted messaging apps where senior procurement officers still posted anonymously. He didn't speak the language, of the culture, of the business, or of the people. While he shouted into a void with mass emails full of bold fonts and American bravado, I slipped in through the back door. Invited. Within 2 months, I received a call from a logistics firm in Osaka. We'd demoed for them the previous year, but they'd gone silent after a certain VP mishandled the follow-up. Now, under new leadership, they remembered me. The woman who had stayed after the meeting asked questions about their regional delivery routes and complimented their tea ceremony protocol. Then came another, an agricultural equipment manufacturer in Niigata. One of their executives still had my old business card, creased, slightly faded, but held on to. He called my personal number. Then another. A steel supplier in Nagoya who told me, with a dry chuckle, that he remembered my patience when his engineers grilled me for over an hour. "You didn't interrupt once," he said. "You even laughed at their jokes. That's rare." By the time autumn leaves started painting Tokyo's parks in crimson and gold, Tanabata Consulting had 5 active contracts, all former prospects, all once engaged with the firm I'd left behind. None of them mentioned Kevin by name, but the implications hung heavy in the silence. In private, they were candid. One CEO shared how embarrassed he felt when Kevin had dismissed his senior engineer's safety concerns in a meeting. Another told me that Kevin's team sent a quarterly newsletter where the firm's name was misspelled 3 times. A third pulled up an email and smirked. "He talks like he's selling microwave ovens." I never once spoke ill of Kevin. I didn't have to. I simply delivered. I showed up. I listened. I followed up when I said I would. I sent updates before being asked. I reviewed proposals in their native formatting standards. I learned which months their factories did maintenance shutdowns and scheduled reviews accordingly. I treated them not like leads, but like legacies. The money was good, but the validation was better. Every new contract was a quiet rebellion, a whisper that moved from boardroom to boardroom, not out of spite, but out of memory, out of loyalty to someone who had earned it. By the end of Q4, I had tripled my projected income. My days were full, my nights were late, and my calendar was a maze of overlapping time zones and annotated agendas. But I had built something, not a revenge campaign, a legacy. And soon, the only name on their shortlist wasn't my former employer. It was mine. While my calendar overflowed with calls, consultations, and meticulous growth plans, chaos was brewing at my former company. It didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take long. At first, they assumed the silence from clients was temporary, a holiday lull, a global slowdown. Excuses were easy to fabricate. Kevin told the sales team to stay the course. But then a pattern emerged. Emails weren't returned, meetings postponed indefinitely, proposals sat untouched in inboxes. The outreach became increasingly desperate. They tried new scripts, slicker graphics, rebranded slogans, but it was like shouting into a canyon. All they heard was their own echo. The CRM filled with red flags and cold trails. The clients weren't just distracted, they were gone. Kevin, never one for subtlety, replaced me almost immediately. He hired a young MBA graduate from a prestigious school, convinced that pedigree alone would suffice. The resume sparkled. The experience did not. On his first client call, the new guy mispronounced the name of the Japanese executive at a critical account. Badly. Not a small slip, a disrespectful one. Then, in a misguided attempt to display cultural intelligence, he opened the meeting with a butchered Mandarin greeting. Not only was it the wrong phrase, it was the wrong language entirely. The client was Japanese. The Japanese are patient, graceful in embarrassment. They smiled, and then they never called back. Behind closed doors, the panic began. Kevin started weekly strategy fire drills, dragging exhausted teams into calls with buzzwords like pipeline recalibration and localized engagement optimization. He sent out KPIs flagged in red, held brainstorming sessions that ran past dinner, and introduced 5-point plans with vague names like Operation Restore. But everyone in the room saw the writing on the wall. Deals were collapsing, one after another. Long-term negotiations went silent. Signed contracts were quietly dissolved. Clients who had once replied within hours now ghosted them completely. Even legacy accounts that had weathered past missteps began moving operations elsewhere. Kevin tried to salvage it. He brought in a consulting firm to audit their brand image. He paid for crash course workshops on cross-cultural etiquette. He pushed junior associates to follow up more assertively, but the firm's name no longer meant trust. It meant failure. They had replaced connection with strategy, depth with pitch decks. Kevin never said my name. He couldn't. But I lingered in the margins, an unspoken variable on every missed opportunity. My departure wasn't a headline. It was a slow hemorrhage, one they couldn't cauterize because they never understood where the bleeding had begun. Internally, staff grew cynical. Meetings ended with shrugs. Talented people began quietly applying elsewhere. Morale dipped. What had once been quiet pride turned into careful disengagement. Externally, the brand slipped. Mentions dwindled. Partner invites stopped arriving. Whispers swirled through industry forums, the kind that don't make press releases, but move faster than PR ever could. Then came the desperation. In late November, Kevin started sending personal emails to former contacts. They were clumsy, overly direct, transactional, laced with urgency. When that failed, he called Kogain Industries directly. Mr. Sakamoto didn't take the call. His assistant responded kindly but firmly. Future communications should be directed to their official external consultant. Me. Kevin's influence began to unravel. Even his own team started second-guessing him. He called emergency meetings that no one respected, issued directives that quietly went ignored. Clients who once tolerated him now blocked him entirely. And all the while, I continued my work. Quietly, patiently. I cultivated my network, delivered consistently, and kept my promises. I checked in on former assistants, remembered birthdays, translated local procurement forms before being asked. Because when you plant seeds with care, water them with trust, and protect them from ego, what grows is not just success, it's resilience. And no storm, no rebranding, no desperate email can uproot it. The firm's unraveling reached its breaking point in early December. The silence from clients had become deafening. Entire pipelines dried up. Contracts vanished into the ether, and even the most loyal accounts stopped answering Kevin's calls. His bright-eyed optimism faded into hushed conference calls and a tightening jaw. With revenue tanking and no lifelines in sight, Kevin stopped pretending it wasn't personal. The firm's focus shifted, not to recovery, but to retribution. And I became the target. It started with whispers. A former colleague, one of the few who hadn't turned their back on me, sent me a screenshot of a Slack message from someone in legal. We're reviewing past consultant agreements for possible breaches. Julia. Then the official envelope arrived. Cream-colored, heavy paper. The company's seal embossed across the flap. Inside, an accusation. Breach of contract. Solicitation of former clients. Undermining proprietary strategy. The tone was performative, aggressive. But the substance? Paper-thin. It was a bluff, and I had been waiting for it. What Kevin and his legal team had failed to remember, or perhaps never even noticed, was that I never signed a contract, not one. There was no non-compete clause, no non-solicitation agreement, no official termination letter. Kevin had been in such a rush to make his grand show of authority that the paperwork had never caught up with the performance. HR had scheduled a termination follow-up call. It never happened. I had received verbal notice, nothing more. Meanwhile, I had receipts. Every internal message where my role was minimized, my dismissal discussed without my inclusion. Email threads where I asked for clarification and was ignored. The Slack history showing Kevin telling the operations team, "Just cut her out, she'll get the message." And the most damning of all, a final message from HR, dated 2 days after I walked out of the Tokyo boardroom, that read, "We'll circle back with formal paperwork this week." They never did. In the weeks after leaving, I'd compiled everything, quietly, methodically. Copies of emails, screenshots of chats, a full log of every client interaction, complete with timestamps and context. And I had registered Tanabata Consulting 3 weeks before the Tokyo incident, anticipating exactly the kind of chaos Kevin eventually unleashed. So when that legal notice landed in my hands, I didn't panic. I smiled. I crafted a response. Crisp, precise. 3 paragraphs that dismantled their argument with the cold elegance of a well-played shogi match. I attached every document. I highlighted key dates. I laid out the facts like a clean ledger. Then I ended with this. As I was never presented with a binding agreement, and as all client relationships were rekindled through publicly available knowledge and voluntary re-engagement, no contractual violation has occurred. Should you wish to pursue further action, I am prepared to share these materials publicly, along with a documented summary of my departure. I clicked send. 2 days later, they folded. No further action will be taken at this time. No apology, no retraction, just silence. The same silence Kevin had received from the clients I now served. But that moment planted a seed. For months, I had kept my head down, focused on the work, on rebuilding, on staying ethical, neutral, quiet. But now I had a story. Not about revenge, about resilience. So I wrote, not a tell-all, a testimony, a reflection on what it means to be cast aside and to return stronger, smarter, unbroken. I framed it as a piece about independent consulting, about navigating betrayal in business, about the quiet strength of walking away and still winning. I titled it, When the Door Closes, Build a Window, Consulting Without Permission. I submitted it to a major industry journal. It was accepted within 48 hours. And when it went live, the ripple began immediately. One message, then 5, then a dozen, not just clients, colleagues, students, former mentors, women in finance, engineers in Germany, startup founders in India, each message a thread of solidarity. Thank you for writing this. You gave words to what I couldn't explain. You made me feel seen. I hadn't just cleared my name. I'd opened a door. The article changed everything. The messages of support were overwhelming. But what came next was unexpected. Journalists. Not one or two, but several. They reached out privately, politely, asking if I'd be willing to speak further. They had read between the lines. They suspected there was more beneath the surface. And they were right. For a week, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted to go public with the full story. But then I remembered that envelope, the accusations, the threats, the way Kevin had weaponized the company's name against me without so much as a legal foundation to stand on. He had tried to ruin me, so I compiled everything. A secure drive with documents, internal Slack messages, timelines, records of calls, screenshots, and project files. Everything that painted the picture, not just of my dismissal, but of a culture of mismanagement, humiliation, and deliberate deception. I sent it not to just one journalist, but to 3. Carefully selected, trusted voices in business ethics, corporate fraud, and investigative reporting. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The truth was damning enough. 2 weeks later, the story broke. The headline ran bold across the homepage of one of the most respected investigative sites in the industry. Consultant silenced. How internal politics destroyed a tech darling's future. The article was brutal. It documented the mishandled negotiations, the cultural missteps, the contracts lost, and the employee exodus. It quoted internal messages that revealed Kevin's deliberate sabotage of my position, his overreach, and the negligent handling of client relationships. It included anonymized statements from former staff and clients who confirmed everything. One even referred to the company as a once respected name, now running on fumes and arrogance. The backlash was immediate. Investors pulled out. Stock dipped 15% in one day. By the end of the week, it was down 23%. Kevin was called into an emergency board meeting. Several directors resigned. Clients issued public statements distancing themselves from the firm. One high-profile Japanese partner announced that they had reevaluated alignment and would be transitioning to external consultants. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply exhaled. Years of silence, gaslighting, dismissal. It had finally been named, seen, validated. My inbox flooded with more than support now. Opportunities, invitations to speak, boards asking for insight, investors wanting to back new projects. But more than that, I got letters. From women who had been sidelined, from interns who watched too much and said too little, from quiet warriors who had never felt brave enough to whisper back. And all of them said the same thing. Thank you. The boardroom was glass-walled and sterile. But the atmosphere inside was anything but transparent. Kevin sat at the end of the long oak table, his once bright bravado dulled into nervous fidgeting. His suit, impeccably pressed, did little to hide the sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Around him sat shareholders, attorneys, executives, all waiting. The chair of the board, a stately woman named Margaret Liu, stood. This meeting has been called to address the substantial reputational and legal damage sustained by the firm following recent revelations. We will begin with evidence. What followed was surgical. One by one, printed emails, Slack transcripts, internal reports, and memos were passed down the table. Each one carefully chosen, each one damning. An HR exchange detailing the lack of a formal termination process. A time-stamped thread of Kevin's unilateral decision to dismiss me without documentation. A message to a colleague boasting, "She's out, I made sure of it." Kevin opened his mouth once, to object, to explain. But Margaret raised a hand. "You will have an opportunity to respond after the reading is complete." More documents came, client feedback logs, a breakdown of the firm's financial collapse, mapped directly to the timeline of my exit and the fallout. Testimonies, anonymous but direct, about the hostile culture Kevin had fostered. Misogynistic comments, dismissive behavior, strategic errors he refused to acknowledge. Finally, Margaret turned to the room. "We have also received a formal statement from Ms. Julia Bennett. She has agreed to testify during the ethics review scheduled next week." The room shifted. Eyes widened. Whispers stirred. Kevin paled. Someone asked, "She's agreed to appear in person?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, and she has provided full documentation that has been independently verified." Kevin sat back in his chair, lips pressed into a thin line. He had nothing, no contracts, no counter-evidence, only bravado and failing memory. No one defended him. Not this time. By the time the meeting adjourned, the conclusion was unspoken but clear. Kevin's authority was gone. His voice, once the loudest in every room, was now met with silence. No one believed him anymore. And I wasn't done. The sky stretched wide and cloudless above Kyoto, a shade of blue so pure it seemed painted. From my office, a glass-walled corner suite on the 30th floor, I could see the gentle collision of tradition and ambition. Below, tiled temple roofs curved like the strokes of calligraphy, nestled among cherry trees just beginning to blossom. Beyond them, sleek glass buildings glinted in the sun, rising quietly but confidently into the sky. This view, this city, this moment, it was everything I had fought for, and more. I leaned back in my chair, fingers resting lightly on the heavy bond paper before me. It bore the insignia of a logistics conglomerate that controlled an immense share of the APAC supply chain. For years, they had partnered with the firm I once worked for. Now, they were placing that future in my hands. Their entire regional client portfolio, over a dozen long-standing accounts, some dating back decades, was being entrusted to Tanabata Consulting. My company, my vision, my terms. There were no champagne flutes, no staged photographs, just a fountain pen with a gold nib, a solemn nod, and a reverent hush that felt more powerful than any applause. I signed. Not with triumph, not with defiance, but with clarity. The road to this moment had been steep and fraught. The company that dismissed me had collapsed inward like a dying star, consumed by arrogance, mismanagement, and its own inability to understand value. Kevin, the man who tried to erase me, had been quietly ushered out, his reputation in tatters. The last I'd heard, he was consulting for a startup that hadn't yet discovered its product. They had called it a strategic transition. But behind closed doors, the board had seen the documents. They had read the testimony. They had heard the truth. And so had the world. Meanwhile, Tanabata grew. Not with noise, but with trust. I hired carefully, drawing from a network of quiet brilliance, linguists, analysts, advisors who had lived and worked across cultures. We weren't just a consultancy, We were a bridge. We helped companies not just enter new markets, but become part of them. We translated more than language. We translated intent. Every meeting began with research. Every call was followed by a handwritten note. Our onboarding guides included etiquette tips, historical context, and regional dialects. And it paid off. Clients didn't just stay. They referred. They advocated. They returned. There were no slogans on our walls, no forced team-building retreats, no glitzy investor updates, only quiet excellence. A culture built not on volume, but on grace. Because the world didn't need another loud empire. It needed dignity. And that's what we were building. The executive across from me, a thoughtful man with salt and pepper hair and a smile that didn't come easily, placed his seal beside my signature. He bowed. "We look forward to this partnership, Bennett-san. Your work speaks for itself." I returned the bow, my voice steady. "Thank you. We will serve you with honor." Outside, the wind moved through Kyoto like a whisper, gentle, precise, and impossible to ignore. I didn't need loud declarations. I didn't need revenge. I had something better, a future, and it was only just beginning. I resumed my seat, opened my binder, and began, to find out if I was still available.